She was abandoned at the station with nothing but a suitcase and a broken promise. Just another unwanted soul in a town that thrived on cruelty. The family that was supposed to take her in took one look and turned their backs, leaving her stranded in the freezing night with nowhere to go. But then a stranger arrived with two little girls who saw something no one else did. He said 5 words that changed everything. "My girls need someone like you." What happened next tore apart a town built on lies, tested a man who thought he'd lost everything, and proved that sometimes the families we choose are stronger than the ones we're born into. If you want to see how a rejected woman became the one person an entire community couldn't destroy, stay with me until the very end. And hey, drop a like and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The train pulled away from Black Ridge Station just after dusk, leaving Elara Quinn standing alone on the platform with a worn leather suitcase and the last shreds of hope she'd been clinging to for 3 weeks. The wind cut through her thin coat like it had a personal grudge, and the sky overhead had that heavy gray look that promised snow before morning. She watched the train's lights disappear into the darkness, carrying away the conductor who'd looked at her with something close to pity when she'd asked if there was another train coming through tonight. There wasn't. Black Ridge wasn't the kind of place trains stopped at often. It was barely the kind of place that qualified as a town. Just a collection of weathered buildings huddled together against the wilderness, like they were trying to stay warm. The station itself was nothing more than a covered platform with a bench that had seen better days and a dim lantern that flickered like it might give up any second. Elara set her suitcase down and sat on the bench, pulling her coat tighter, even though it didn't help much. Her fingers were already going numb. She'd been cold before, plenty of times, but this was different. This was the kind of cold that settled into your bones and made you wonder if you'd ever feel warm again. The letter in her pocket felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. She didn't need to take it out to remember what it said. She'd read it enough times on the train ride here that she'd memorized every word. "Dear Miss Quinn, we are delighted to offer you a position as governess for our children. The frontier is harsh, but we believe a young woman of your character will find a home with our family." Character. That was a funny word for it. What they'd really meant was desperation, and they'd been right about that part at least. She'd arrived at their house 2 hours ago, suitcase in hand and ready to start the new life they'd promised. The woman who answered the door had looked her up and down with the kind of expression you'd give a stray dog that wandered onto your property. Then she'd called for her husband, and they'd both stood there in the doorway, blocking her from coming inside, while they delivered the news that they'd changed their minds. "We've decided to hire someone local," the woman had said, not quite meeting Elara's eyes. "Someone the children already know. I'm sure you understand." Elara had understood perfectly. She understood that the letter had been written months ago, when they were still desperate enough to consider a stranger from back east. She understood that sometime between then and now, they'd found someone better. Someone who didn't show up looking quite so worn around the edges, with a suitcase that had been repaired 3 times and boots that were starting to split at the seams. She'd stood there on their porch, watching her entire future collapse, and the only thing she'd been able to think was how far away the train station was and whether she had enough money left for the walk back. The husband had pressed $2 into her hand like that made it better, like that somehow compensated for bringing her all the way out to the middle of nowhere and then slamming the door in her face. The station bench was uncomfortable, but Elara had slept in worse places. She'd spent 3 nights on a train with nothing but her coat for a blanket. She'd spent a week in a boarding house that rented rooms by the hour to women who weren't particular about their work. She'd spent a cold winter in Chicago, sharing a room with 5 other women, all of them competing for the same low-paying factory jobs. This was just another night, just another disappointment, just another reminder that she'd been stupid to hope for something better. She closed her eyes and tried to think about what came next. She had $4.37 left. Not enough to get back east, even if there was anything waiting for her there. Not enough to rent a room for more than a few nights, and that was assuming anyone in Black Ridge would even rent to her. The conductor had mentioned something about a boarding house near the edge of town, but his tone had suggested it wasn't the kind of place a woman stayed unless she was out of options. Elara was definitely out of options. The sound of boots on wood made her open her eyes. A man was walking onto the platform from the direction of town, moving with the kind of unhurried pace that suggested he had nowhere urgent to be. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat and a hat pulled low against the wind. For a second, Elara thought he might be the station manager, But then she remembered the conductor saying something about how nobody manned the station after dark anymore. The man stopped when he saw her, and even in the dim light from the lantern, she could see his expression shift from mild surprise to something more guarded. He looked at her, then at her suitcase, then back at her face. "Train's gone," he said. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. "I know," Elara said. He stood there for a moment, clearly trying to figure out what she was doing sitting alone at a train station after dark. She could see the question forming, and she really didn't want to answer it. She didn't want to explain about the letter or the family or the door closing in her face. She didn't want his pity or his judgment or whatever else might come with telling a stranger that she had nowhere to go. "You waiting for someone?" he asked finally. "No." The man's jaw tightened slightly, and she could see him processing that answer. No train coming, nobody to meet, just a woman sitting alone in the cold with a suitcase that had seen too many miles. "Station's not safe at night," he said. "You should head into town." "I'm fine here." "You're not fine. You're freezing and it's going to snow." He said it matter-of-factly, not meanly, just stating an obvious truth. "Boarding house is about a mile that way. Mrs. Carson runs it. Tell her Colt sent you." Elara looked at him more carefully. He was probably in his early 30s, with the kind of weathered face that came from spending too much time outdoors. There were lines around his eyes and mouth that suggested he'd seen his share of hard winters. His coat was well made but worn, and his boots were the practical kind you wore when you actually needed them to last, not the fancy kind you wore to look important. "I appreciate the advice," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "But like I said, I'm fine." Colt, if that was really his name, looked at her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. "You got money for the boarding house?" "That's none of your business." "Fair enough." He shifted his weight, glancing back toward town, then back at her. "Look, I'm not trying to cause trouble, but if you're planning to spend the night out here, you should know that the temperature's going to drop another 20 degrees before morning. Station bench won't keep you warm enough." "I've slept in worse places." Something changed in his expression then. Not pity exactly, but a kind of recognition. Like maybe he understood what she wasn't saying out loud. "I'm sure you have," he said quietly. "But you don't have to tonight." Before Elara could respond, she heard another sound. Smaller footsteps, running this time. Two little girls came racing onto the platform, both of them bundled up in coats that were slightly too big. They couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, and they looked exactly alike. Twins, Elara realized. "Papa," one of them shouted. "You said you were just checking if the medicine came." "I did check," Colt said, his voice softening in a way that caught Elara off guard. "It didn't. We'll try again next week." The girls noticed Elara then, and both of them stopped short, staring at her with the kind of open curiosity that only children could manage. One of them had a small cut above her eyebrow, fresh enough that it was still red. "Who's that?" the girl with the cut asked. "Nobody," Elara said quickly. At the same time, Colt said, "A traveler." The twins looked at each other, having some kind of silent conversation that only siblings could have. Then they both looked back at Elara, and the one without the cut stepped forward. "Are you lost?" she asked. "Lily," Colt said, a warning note in his voice. "Mind your manners." "I'm just asking," Lily said, not taking her eyes off Elara. "She looks sad." Elara felt something twist in her chest. She wasn't used to children noticing her at all, let alone caring enough to comment on how she looked. "I'm not sad," she lied. "Just waiting." "For what?" This came from the other twin, the one with the cut. "Emma, that's enough," Colt said, but there was no real force behind it. He was watching Elara now, and she could feel the weight of his attention like something physical. "Girls, go wait by the wagon. I'll be there in a minute." The twins hesitated, clearly wanting to stay and ask more questions, but something in their father's tone must have convinced them. They trudged off the platform, casting backward glances at Elara as they went. Once they were out of earshot, Colt turned back to her. "You came here for work," he said. It wasn't a question. Elara didn't answer. She didn't know this man her story. "Let me guess," he continued, his voice careful. "Someone made you an offer, said they needed help. Then you showed up and they decided they didn't need you after all." She felt her face flush, anger and embarrassment mixing together. "Like I said, none of your business." "You're right," Colt agreed. Except I know most of the families in this area, and I can think of exactly one that's been talking about hiring a governess. The Mitchells, right? Elara's silence was answer enough. Colt's jaw tightened again, and this time there was something close to anger in his expression. They're good at that, making promises they don't keep. He looked away, out into the darkness where his daughters had gone. Look, I'm not going to stand here and tell you what to do, but I've got a ranch about 6 miles north of here. It's not fancy, and it's not easy, but it's warm and there's food. You can stay the night at least. Get your bearings before you decide what's next. I don't accept charity from strangers, Elara said. Good, because I'm not offering charity. He met her eyes, and there was something in his gaze that made her breath catch. Not attraction exactly, but a kind of raw honesty that she hadn't expected. My girls need someone like you. You don't know anything about me. I know you're sitting alone at a train station in the middle of winter with nowhere to go, and you're still too proud to ask for help. I know the Mitchells turned you away, which means you're probably educated enough to scare them. And I know my daughters walked up to a complete stranger, and the first thing they did was worry about whether you were sad. He paused. Kids are good at seeing things adults miss. Elara wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him to leave her alone, that she didn't need his pity or his job offer or whatever this was. But the truth was sitting heavy in her chest, cold and undeniable. She had nowhere else to go. She could spend the night freezing on this bench, or she could swallow her pride and take the chance he was offering. One night, she heard herself say, "That's all." Something that might have been relief crossed Colt's face. One night, he agreed. He picked up her suitcase before she could protest, and she followed him off the platform and into the darkness beyond. The twins were waiting by a wagon, both of them bundled up and watching her approach with wide eyes. The horses, 2 sturdy-looking mares, stamped their feet impatiently in the cold. "This is Miss—" Colt trailed off, realizing he didn't know her name. "Quinn," Elara said. "Elara Quinn. Miss Quinn is going to stay with us tonight," Colt told his daughters, loading her suitcase into the back of the wagon. "I want you both to be respectful and let her get some rest." "Can she sit with us?" Lily asked immediately. "I don't think—" Elara started. "Please," Emma added, and there was something so earnest in her voice that Elara felt her resistance crumbling. "If Miss Quinn wants to sit with you, she can," Colt said, climbing up onto the driver's seat, "but she might prefer the front where it's quieter." The twins were already scooting over to make room in the back, and Elara found herself climbing up to join them before she'd fully decided to do it. The wagon bed was lined with blankets, and there was a lantern hanging from a hook that provided a small circle of warmth and light. The twins pressed close to her on either side, and she could feel the heat from their small bodies seeping through her coat. Colt clicked his tongue at the horses, and the wagon lurched into motion. The girls started chattering immediately, asking questions about where she came from and whether she'd ever seen an ocean, and if she knew any good stories. Elara answered as best she could, surprised to find that talking to them was easier than she'd expected. They didn't have that calculated quality that adults always seem to carry. They just asked what they wanted to know, and they listened to her answers like they actually cared. "Papa doesn't tell very good stories," Lily confided at one point. "He always falls asleep in the middle." "I do not," Colt called back from the driver's seat, and Elara could hear the smile in his voice even though she couldn't see his face. "You do too," Emma said loyally. "Remember last week when you were telling us about the cattle drive and you just stopped talking?" "That's because you two were already asleep," Colt said. "We were not." Elara found herself almost smiling, something she hadn't done in weeks. There was something warm about listening to them argue, something that felt almost like belonging, even though she knew it was temporary. One night, she reminded herself, that's all this was. The ride took almost an hour, the wagon following a rough road that cut through open country. The landscape was nothing but darkness and the occasional silhouette of a tree or rock formation. The cold was brutal, but the twins kept her warm on either side, and eventually she felt herself starting to relax despite everything. "There it is," Colt said finally, and Elara looked up to see lights in the distance. The Mercer ranch wasn't what she'd been expecting. It was bigger than she'd imagined, a sprawling main house with a wide porch, several outbuildings, and a barn that looked solid and well-maintained. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and as they got closer, she could see lamplight glowing in the windows. It looked like the kind of place that had been standing for generations, built to withstand harsh winters and whatever else the frontier could throw at it. Colt pulled the wagon to a stop near the house, and an older man emerged from the front door, carrying a rifle that he lowered when he saw who it was. "About time," the old man said, his voice gruff. "Girls are going to freeze solid if you keep them out much longer." He noticed Elara then, and his expression shifted to something wary. "Who's this?" "Miss Quinn," Colt said, climbing down and reaching up to help the twins out of the wagon. "She's staying the night." The old man, Elara assumed he was Colt's father from the resemblance around the eyes, looked at her with obvious suspicion. "We don't take in strays." "Dad," Colt said quietly, a warning in his voice. "I'm not a stray," Elara said, finding her voice. "And I'll be gone in the morning." The old man grunted but didn't argue further. He turned and headed back into the house, leaving the door open behind him. The twins had already raced inside, their voices echoing back out into the night. Colt retrieved Elara's suitcase and gestured for her to follow him. "Don't mind my father," he said as they walked toward the house. "He's not used to visitors." "Neither am I," Elara said. Inside, the house was exactly what she'd expected. Practical, worn, but solid. The main room had a large fireplace with a fire crackling away, throwing heat and light across the space. There was a long table, several mismatched chairs, and shelves lined with books and tools and things that suggested this was a home where people actually lived, not just existed. The walls were bare wood, and there were mud stains near the door and scratches on the floor from boots and dogs and years of use. The twins were already pulling off their coats and talking over each other, telling their grandfather something about the train station. The old man was mostly ignoring them, stirring something in a pot that hung over the fire. "Girls, go wash up," Colt said. "Dinner's almost ready." They groaned but obeyed, disappearing through a doorway into another part of the house. Colt set Elara's suitcase down near the door and gestured to one of the chairs by the fire. "Sit," he said. "Warm up." Elara did, and the heat from the fire was almost painful after being cold for so long. She held her hands out toward the flames, feeling sensation slowly return to her fingers. Colt's father dished out bowls of stew without saying anything, and when the twins came back, they all sat down at the table together. It was simple food, meat, potatoes, vegetables, but it was hot, and there was plenty of it. Elara ate slowly, aware of 3 sets of eyes watching her from across the table. The twins kept whispering to each other and giggling, and Colt kept glancing at her like he was trying to figure something out. "So what's your plan?" the old man asked finally, breaking the awkward silence. Colt said, "You're only here for the night." "That's right," Elara said. "And then what?" "William," Colt said, his voice tight. "It's a fair question," William said. "Girl shows up in the middle of winter with nowhere to go. She's either running from something or running towards something, and either way it's going to cause problems." Elara set down her spoon carefully. "I appreciate the meal and the warm place to sleep," she said, keeping her voice level. "But my plans are my business." William grunted. "Suit yourself." The rest of the meal passed in tense silence, broken only by the twins asking if they could have seconds and whether Miss Quinn liked horses. When the bowls were empty, Colt stood and started clearing the table, and Elara moved to help him. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I don't mind." They worked in silence, washing dishes in a basin near the fire, while the twins played with a set of wooden toys in the corner and William smoked a pipe near the door. The old man kept watching her, and Elara could feel his distrust like something physical. "I'll show you where you're sleeping," Colt said finally, drying his hands on a cloth. He led her through the house to a small room at the back. It wasn't much, just a bed, a chair, and a window that looked out into darkness, but it was clean, and there were extra blankets folded at the foot of the bed. "It's not fancy," Colt said, setting her suitcase down inside. "It's fine," Elara said. And it was. It was more than fine, actually. It was warm and dry and safe, and that was more than she'd had a few hours ago. Colt lingered in the doorway, and Elara could tell he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Look," he said, "I know you said one night, and I respect that. But if you need more time to figure things out, the offer stands. We could use the help around here, and the girls—" He trailed off, glancing back toward the main room where his daughters were still playing. "They haven't warmed up to anyone like that in a long time." Elara felt that twist in her chest again. Why? She asked. Why do you need help? Where's their mother? Something shuddered in Colt's expression. Their mother's gone, he said flatly. Has been for 3 years. I'm sorry. Don't be, it's just how things are. He straightened like he was physically pushing the emotion away. Anyway, think about it. No pressure. But if you decide to stay a bit longer, we'd be glad to have you. He left before she could respond, closing the door behind him. Elara stood there in the small room, listening to the muffled sounds of the house settling around her. She could hear the twins laughing, hear William's low voice saying something she couldn't make out, hear the crackle of the fire in the main room. She sat down on the bed, and it was softer than she'd expected. Her whole body ached from the cold and the travel and the emotional weight of the day. She should have been thinking about what came next, making plans, figuring out how to stretch her remaining money far enough to get somewhere else. Instead, she found herself thinking about those 2 little girls and the way they'd looked at her, like she was someone worth knowing, like she mattered. One night, she told herself again. But even as she thought it, she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. She lay down without changing out of her clothes, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Through the window, she could see snow starting to fall, fat flakes drifting down out of the darkness. The storm Colt had predicted was arriving right on schedule. Elara closed her eyes and let herself drift, exhaustion pulling her under. Her last thought before sleep took her was that tomorrow she'd have to decide, keep running or take the risk of staying in a place that felt dangerously close to what she'd always wanted and never thought she'd have. A place that felt like it might become home. Elara woke to the sound of small voices arguing just outside her door. The room was still dark, but thin gray light was starting to creep through the window, and she could hear the wind howling against the side of the house. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, and then it all came rushing back. The train station, Colt Mercer, the twins, the offer she hadn't quite accepted or refused. "You wake her up," one of the twins was whispering. "No, you do it," the other one whispered back. "Papa said to let her sleep." "Papa also said breakfast is ready and we should tell her." Elara sat up, pushing the blankets back. Her body ached from the cold and the travel, but the room was warm enough that she hadn't frozen during the night. She ran her fingers through her hair, trying to make herself presentable, and then opened the door. Both twins jumped back, startled. They were already dressed for the day, wearing simple dresses and thick stockings, their hair braided identically. "Good morning," Elara said. "Good morning," they said in unison, then dissolved into giggles. "Papa made breakfast," Lily said, once she'd recovered. "He said we should tell you, but not wake you up, but we didn't know if you were awake or not, so we were just listening to see if you were moving around," Emma finished. "Well, I'm awake now," Elara said. She glanced down at herself, realizing she was still wearing yesterday's dress, wrinkled and travel-stained. "Give me a few minutes to make myself decent." The twins nodded and raced off down the hallway, their footsteps thundering on the wooden floor. Elara closed the door and opened her suitcase, pulling out a fresh dress and doing what she could to smooth out the wrinkles. There was a basin of water on the chair that hadn't been there last night. Someone must have brought it while she was sleeping, and she used it to wash her face and hands, the cold water shocking her fully awake. When she finally made her way to the main room, she found the whole household already gathered around the table. Colt was at the stove, flipping what looked like pancakes, while William sat at the head of the table reading a newspaper that was probably a week old. The twins were bouncing in their seats, waiting impatiently. "Miss Quinn," Lily said, "sit here, next to me." "No, next to me," Emma argued. "Girls," Colt said without turning around, "let her pick where she wants to sit." Elara chose a seat between them, and they both looked satisfied with that compromise. Colt brought over a platter of pancakes and a jar of what looked like honey, setting them down in the center of the table. "Coffee?" he asked Elara. "Please." He poured her a cup from a pot that had been warming near the fire, and she wrapped her hands around it gratefully. The coffee was strong and bitter, the kind you drank because you needed it, not because it tasted good. She'd had worse. They ate in relative silence, the twins occasionally asking their father questions about the horses or the weather, and William ignoring everyone in favor of his newspaper. Elara noticed that Colt kept glancing at her when he thought she wasn't looking, like he was trying to gauge whether she was planning to leave the moment breakfast was over. She wasn't sure herself. The smart thing would be to thank them for their hospitality and head into town, find that boarding house Colt had mentioned, and figure out her next move. But the problem was that she didn't have a next move. She had barely enough money to survive for a week, maybe 2 if she was careful, and then what? She couldn't go back east. There was nothing waiting for her there except more disappointment, and she couldn't stay in Black Ridge without work. "So," William said suddenly, folding his newspaper and looking directly at her, "you planning to tell us what you're running from?" "Dad," Colt said, a warning in his voice. "What?" "It's a reasonable question. Girl shows up out of nowhere, got nowhere to go, won't talk about where she came from. That's usually because she's got something to hide. Or because it's none of your business," Elara said, meeting his gaze steadily. William's eyes narrowed, but there was something that might have been respect in his expression. "Fair enough. But if you're planning to stick around here, even for a few days, I'd like to know we're not harboring a criminal." "I'm not a criminal." "Then what are you?" "William, that's enough," Colt said firmly. "No, it's fine," Elara said. She set down her coffee cup and looked at the old man directly. "I came out here because I was offered a job as a governess. The family changed their minds. I don't have enough money to go anywhere else, and I don't have any family to take me in. That's the whole story. No secrets, no crimes, nothing dramatic. Just bad luck and poor timing." William studied her for a long moment, and she refused to look away. Finally, he grunted and picked up his newspaper again. "At least you're honest about it." The twins had been watching this exchange with wide eyes, and now Emma reached over and patted Elara's hand. "Don't worry," she whispered. "Grandpa's mean to everyone." "I heard that," William said from behind his newspaper. After breakfast, Colt announced that he had work to do in the barn and that the twins needed to help. They protested that they wanted to stay with Miss Quinn, but he was firm, and eventually they trudged outside, bundled up against the cold. William disappeared into another part of the house, leaving Elara alone in the main room. She stood there for a moment, unsure what to do with herself. She should probably start packing her things, get ready to leave. But instead, she found herself looking around the room, noticing details she'd missed last night. There were photographs on the mantel above the fireplace, old ones, faded and formal. She moved closer to examine them. Most of them showed people she didn't recognize, presumably Colt's parents and grandparents. But there was one that caught her attention. It was more recent, showing a younger version of Colt standing next to a woman with dark hair and a warm smile. She was holding 2 babies, and Colt's arm was around her waist. They both looked happy in a way that seemed almost foreign in this harsh place. "That's my mother," a small voice said behind her. Elara turned to find Emma standing in the doorway, alone. "I thought you were helping your father." "I told him I needed to use the privy," Emma said, moving to stand next to Elara. "He won't notice if I take a little while." They both looked at the photograph. "She was pretty," Elara said. "Papa says we look like her." Emma tilted her head, considering the image. "I don't remember her very much, just little pieces, like how she used to sing when she was cooking, and how she always smelled like lavender." "How old were you when she—" "2. Lily and I were both 2. Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, but there was something underneath it that made Elara's chest ache. "Papa doesn't like to talk about it. Grandpa says it makes him too sad." "That's understandable." "Do you have a mother?" The question caught Elara off guard. "I did. She died when I was young, too." "And your father?" "Gone." Emma nodded, like this made perfect sense. "So you're alone, like us." "You're not alone," Elara said gently. "You have your father and your grandfather. But no mother." Emma looked up at her with those wide, serious eyes. "Papa tries really hard, but he doesn't know how to do mother things. Like braiding our hair properly, or teaching us to sew, or knowing when we're sad about things we can't explain. He's good at fixing things, and teaching us to ride and making sure we're safe. But it's not the same." Elara didn't know what to say to that. The truth was sitting right there between them, too obvious to ignore. These girls needed a woman in their lives, someone who could fill at least some of the space their mother had left behind. And Colt knew it, which was probably why he'd brought Elara here in the first place. The front door opened and Lily burst in, breathing hard. "Emma, Papa's looking for you. He's going to be mad if he finds out you're not in the privy." Emma gave Elara one last look, something almost pleading in her expression, and then ran back outside with her sister. The door slammed shut behind them, and Elara was alone again with the photographs and the questions she didn't want to ask herself. She spent the rest of the morning trying to stay out of the way. She washed the breakfast dishes, swept the floor, and tidied up the main room even though nobody had asked her to. It gave her something to do with her hands while her mind churned through her limited options. By noon, she'd almost convinced herself to leave when Colt came back inside, stamping snow off his boots. "Storm's getting worse," he said, pulling off his coat. "Roads are going to be impassable by tonight." "How long does that usually last?" "Depends. Could be a day, could be a week." He hung his coat on a peg near the door and turned to look at her. "Look, I know you said one night, but I think we both know you can't leave in this weather. So here's what I'm proposing. Stay until the storm clears. Help out around the house, spend time with the girls, and in exchange you get room and board. No obligations beyond that. Once the roads are clear, you can decide what you want to do." "And if I decide to leave?" "Then you leave. I'm not trying to trap you here, Miss Quinn. I'm just trying to give you options." Elara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she didn't need his help or his options, but the truth was staring her in the face just like that photograph on the mantel. She had nowhere else to go, no money to get there even if she did, and a storm coming that was going to make travel impossible. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. "All right," she said, "until the storm clears." Something that might have been relief crossed Colt's face. Good. The girls are going to be thrilled. He wasn't wrong about that. When the twins came in for lunch and learned that Elara was staying, they practically bounced off the walls with excitement. They peppered her with questions about what games she knew, whether she could read, if she'd ever seen a real horse race, and about 100 other things that made her head spin. Even William seemed slightly less hostile, though he still watched her with that suspicious look whenever he thought she wasn't paying attention. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. The twins showed her around the ranch, or at least the parts they could reach without going too far into the storm. The barn was warm and smelled like hay and horses, and there were 3 dogs living there who greeted the girls with enthusiastic tail wagging. The chickens had a coop attached to one of the outbuildings, and Emma demonstrated how to collect eggs while Lily provided running commentary on which hens were nice and which ones were mean and pecky. "That's Margaret," Lily said, pointing to a particularly aggressive-looking bird. "Don't turn your back on her." "Noted," Elara said. They showed her the tool shed, the smokehouse, the root cellar, and about a dozen other places that all seemed essential to keeping the ranch running. It was more work than Elara had imagined, and she found herself wondering how Colt managed it all with just his father and 2 small children to help. "Papa used to have hired men," Emma explained when Elara asked, "but they all left after Mama died. Grandpa says nobody wants to work for a man who's too sad to run a proper ranch." "Emma, you shouldn't repeat things Grandpa says," Lily hissed. "Why not? It's true." They were walking back toward the house when Elara saw a figure riding through the snow toward them. It was a man on horseback, bundled up against the cold, and he was moving fast despite the weather. Colt emerged from the barn and moved to intercept him, and Elara could see tension in his posture even from a distance. "Who's that?" she asked. "Mr. Harlow," Lily said, her voice losing all its earlier excitement. "He's mean." "Lily," Elara said carefully, "what do you mean he's mean?" But before Lily could answer, Emma grabbed her sister's hand and pulled her toward the house. "Come on, we're not supposed to talk to him." Elara followed them inside, but she stood near the window, watching the exchange between Colt and the visitor. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told her enough. The man, Harlow, was leaning down from his horse, gesturing aggressively. Colt had his arms crossed, his expression hard. The conversation didn't last long. Harlow wheeled his horse around and rode off, and Colt stood there for a moment, watching him go, before turning back toward the house. When he came inside, his jaw was tight and his eyes were cold. William looked up from where he'd been repairing a piece of harness leather. "What did he want?" the old man asked. "Same thing as always," Colt said. "The land." "You tell him no?" "Of course I told him no." Colt pulled off his gloves and threw them on the table harder than necessary. "He's not getting this ranch. I don't care how much money he throws at me." "Who's Mr. Harlow?" Elara asked before she could stop herself. Both men looked at her, and she could see Colt weighing whether to answer. Finally, he sighed. "He owns most of the land around here. Bought up half the ranches in the county over the past 10 years, either through deals or by waiting for people to fail and then taking the property for debts. He's been after this place since before my father's time." "Why?" Water rights, William said. We've got the best water access in the region. Creek runs right through our property, never dries up even in drought. Harlow knows that whoever controls the water controls everything else. And you won't sell? No, Colt said flatly. This land has been in my family for 3 generations. I'm not giving it up because some land grabber wants to expand his empire. The twins had been listening to this exchange with worried expressions, and now Lily moved closer to her father. Is Mr. Harlow going to make us leave? No, sweetheart, Colt said, his voice softening immediately. He knelt down to her level. Nobody's making us leave. This is our home, and we're staying right here. But what if— No, what ifs, Colt said firmly. Now why don't you and Emma go play in your room for a bit? Miss Quinn can come up and check on you in a little while. The girls went reluctantly, casting backward glances as they climbed the stairs to the second floor. Once they were gone, the temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. How bad is it? William asked quietly. Bad, Colt admitted. He's making threats now. Says if I don't sell, he'll find other ways to get what he wants. What kind of other ways? He didn't specify, but I know his reputation. He doesn't make idle threats. Elara felt like she was intruding on a private conversation, but before she could excuse herself, Colt turned to look at her. I want you to know what you're staying in the middle of, he said. This isn't just a struggling ranch in the middle of nowhere. We've got real problems, and they might get worse before they get better. If that makes you want to leave once the storm clears, I'd understand. Elara thought about that. She thought about the photograph on the mantel, about 2 little girls who needed someone, about a man who was clearly carrying more weight than any person should have to carry alone. She thought about how she'd felt sitting on that train station bench, certain that she had nothing left to offer anyone. I'll stay, she heard herself say, at least for now. The next few days fell into a routine that Elara hadn't expected. She woke early, helped prepare breakfast, spent the mornings teaching the twins basic lessons in reading and arithmetic, while Colt and William worked outside in the brutal cold. The storm came and went in waves, dumping snow and then clearing just enough to give false hope before dumping more. The roads stayed impassable, and Elara stopped thinking about leaving. The twins attached themselves to her with an intensity that was both flattering and slightly terrifying. They followed her everywhere, asked her endless questions, and insisted she tuck them in every night with a story. Elara found herself making up elaborate tales about brave princesses and clever foxes and adventures in far-off lands, and the girls hung on every word like she was revealing the secrets of the universe. You're good with them, Colt said one evening after she'd come back downstairs. He was sitting at the table going over what looked like account books, and he looked exhausted. They're good girls, Elara said. They haven't been this happy in a long time. He closed the ledger and rubbed his eyes. I appreciate what you're doing. I know this wasn't what you signed up for. To be fair, I didn't really sign up for anything. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. True enough. He gestured to the other chair. Sit, if you want, unless you're tired. Elara sat. The house was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the wind outside. William had gone to bed an hour ago, and the twins were hopefully asleep by now. Can I ask you something? Colt said. You can ask. I might not answer. Fair. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. Why did you really come out here? And don't tell me it was just for a governess position. You're educated, well-spoken. You could have found work back east. Elara was quiet for a moment, trying to decide how much to tell him. Finally, she said, I was working in a factory. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, barely enough pay to afford a room in a boarding house where 5 other women were competing for the same jobs. I got sick. Nothing serious, just a fever. But I missed 3 days of work, and when I came back, they'd already replaced me. I spent 2 months looking for anything else, burning through what little money I'd saved. Then I saw an advertisement for a governess position out west. It sounded like a new start, somewhere I could be useful instead of just another desperate woman in a city full of desperate women. And then you got here, and the position was already filled. The position never existed. Not really. They posted the advertisement, probably got dozens of responses, and by the time I actually showed up, they decided they didn't need anyone after all. She looked at him directly. So to answer your question, I came here because I had nowhere else to go. That's the truth. Colt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, My wife died in childbirth. Not with the twins, They were almost 3 when it happened. She was pregnant again, and something went wrong. The baby died too. It was winter, and the roads were bad, and by the time we could have gotten her to a doctor, it was too late anyway. Elara felt her breath catch. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. Doesn't change anything. His voice was flat, but she could hear the pain underneath it. After she died, I tried to keep everything running. The ranch, the girls, all of it. But I was barely holding it together. Hired men left because I was too distracted to pay them on time or give them proper direction. Animals died because I missed warning signs I should have caught. The girls cried for their mother, and I didn't know how to comfort them because I was drowning in my own grief. But you kept going. What choice did I have? He looked at her, and there was something raw in his expression. They're my daughters. I couldn't just give up, so I kept going even when I didn't know what I was doing, even when I was barely surviving. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand what you're walking into if you decide to stay longer than just until the storm clears. This ranch is a mess. I'm barely keeping it afloat. Harlow's circling like a vulture, waiting for me to fail so he can swoop in and take everything. And my girls, they need more than I can give them. They need someone who can teach them things I don't know, who can be soft when I'm too hard, who can fill even a fraction of the space their mother left behind. You're asking me to stay permanently. I'm asking you to consider it as a job, not as charity, room, board, and a salary. Nothing fancy, but enough to build a real life if that's what you want. Elara's heart was pounding. This was too much, too fast. She barely knew these people, but the truth was she'd already started to care about them, about the twins with their endless questions and their desperate need for maternal affection, about Colt with his quiet strength and his obvious exhaustion, even about William with his gruff exterior and his fierce protectiveness of his family. I need time to think about it, she said. Take all the time you need. But while you're thinking, know that whatever you decide, I'm grateful you were at that train station when we showed up. He stood and left her sitting there by the fire, and Elara stared into the flames for a long time, trying to sort through the tangle of thoughts and feelings that were threatening to overwhelm her. She'd come west looking for a new start, and here it was, offered up like a gift she hadn't earned. But accepting it meant putting down roots, committing to a place and people she barely knew, in the middle of a situation that was clearly more complicated and dangerous than she'd first realized. The smart thing would be to leave once the roads cleared. The safe thing. But Elara had spent most of her life doing the smart, safe thing. And where had it gotten her? Alone, broke, and desperate at a train station in the middle of nowhere. Maybe it was time to try something different. The decision came to her 2 days later during an afternoon when the storm had temporarily cleared and the sun was making a rare appearance. She was in the barn with the twins, watching them play with the dogs, when she heard shouting from outside. She told the girls to stay put and went to investigate. What she found made her blood run cold. 3 men on horseback had ridden up to the house, and they were confronting Colt and William. One of them was Harlow. She recognized him from before. And the other 2 looked like hired muscle, the kind of men who got paid to intimidate people. Last chance, Mercer, Harlow was saying as Elara approached. Sell now, or I'll make sure you regret it. Get off my property, Colt said, his hand resting on the rifle he was holding. Or what? You'll shoot me? Harlow laughed, but there was no humor in it. That would be a mistake. I've got the sheriff in my pocket, and half the town council besides. You'd hang before sunset. Then I guess we're at an impasse, Colt said. Harlow's expression darkened. You think you're tough? You think you can stand against me? I've broken better men than you, Mercer, and when I'm done, you'll be begging me to take this property off your hands. Mr. Harlow, Elara said, stepping forward before she could think better of it. I think you should leave. All 4 men turned to stare at her. Harlow's eyes narrowed. And who might you be? Someone who doesn't appreciate threats being made against this family. Family? Harlow's laugh was sharp. Is that what you are? Another desperate woman willing to sell herself for a roof over her head? The words hit like a slap, and Elara felt her face flush with anger and shame. But before she could respond, Colt stepped forward, his rifle coming up. You just made a very serious mistake, he said quietly. Harlow's men reached for their own weapons, and for a terrifying moment, Elara thought someone was actually going to get shot. Then William moved, positioning himself next to his son. And suddenly it was 3 against 3, with Elara standing in the middle like an idiot. The tension hung there, thick enough to cut, and then Harlow slowly raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Fine," he said. "We'll go. But this isn't over, Mercer. Not by a long shot." He wheeled his horse around and his men followed. They rode off through the snow, and Elara stood there shaking, adrenaline making her limbs feel weak. "Are you insane?" Colt demanded, turning on her. "What were you thinking, confronting him like that?" "I was thinking he had no right to talk to you that way on your own property. And you had no business getting involved. You could have—" He stopped, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "You could have gotten hurt. But I didn't. This time." His eyes were blazing. "Harlow doesn't make empty threats. He's dangerous, and now you've made yourself a target too." "Good," Elara said, surprising herself. "Because I'm not leaving." Both Colt and William stared at her. "What?" Colt said. "I'm not leaving. Not when the storm clears, not when things get dangerous, not because some bully thinks he can intimidate me into running away." She took a breath, steadying herself. "You offered me a job. I'm accepting. Room, board, salary, all of it. I'm staying." Colt opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked like he wanted to argue, but he also looked relieved, and maybe a little bit hopeful. "You're sure?" he asked finally. "No," Elara admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." A smile broke across his face, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Well, all right then. Welcome to the Mercer Ranch, Miss Quinn. Try not to get shot in your first week." "I'll do my best." The twins heard the news before Elara could even get back to the barn. They came running out, shrieking with joy, and threw themselves at her with enough force that she nearly fell over in the snow. "You're staying!" Lily shouted. "You're really staying!" "Papa told us," Emma added, her face pressed against Elara's coat. "He said you're going to live here and teach us and everything." "That's right," Elara said, her voice catching slightly. She hadn't expected this much enthusiasm, hadn't realized how much they'd been hoping for this outcome. "I'm staying." They pulled her back toward the house, both of them talking over each other about all the things they wanted to show her and teach her and do together, now that she was going to be part of the ranch. Elara let herself be pulled along, feeling something warm settle in her chest, despite the cold air and the lingering fear from the confrontation with Harlow. That night, William pulled her aside after dinner while Colt was putting the girls to bed. The old man had been watching her all evening with that suspicious expression he seemed to reserve just for her, and now he gestured for her to follow him out onto the porch. "You know what you're getting into?" he asked without preamble. "Not entirely," Elara admitted, "but I'm willing to learn. Harlow's not going to let this go. He'll come back, and next time he might not just make threats." "I understand. Do you?" William fixed her with a hard stare. "Because my son's already lost one woman he cared about. I won't stand by and watch him lose another." Elara felt her face heat. This isn't about, it's just a job. For now, maybe. But those girls already love you, and Colt?" He shook his head. "Colt's been dead inside since his wife passed. First time I've seen him look alive in 3 years was when you agreed to stay. So if you're going to leave eventually, if this is just a stopgap until something better comes along, you need to go now before anyone gets more attached." "I'm not planning to leave," Elara said, meeting his gaze. "I gave my word." "Words are easy. Keeping them is harder, especially when things get rough. And they will get rough, girl. Mark my words." He went back inside before she could respond, leaving her standing on the porch in the freezing air, wondering what she'd really signed up for. The conversation unsettled her more than Harlow's threats had, because William was right. She'd already started to care about this family, and that made everything more complicated and dangerous than any external threat ever could. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity and growing tension. The storm finally broke for good, leaving behind snowdrifts that took days to clear. Colt started taking Elara with him into town for supplies, partly because the twins refused to be separated from her, and partly, she suspected, because he wanted the community to see that the Mercer Ranch had someone new helping out, someone who wasn't going to be intimidated into leaving. Black Ridge was exactly what she'd expected, a hard town full of hard people who didn't have much use for outsiders. The general store owner was polite but distant. The blacksmith barely acknowledged her existence, and everywhere she went, she could feel people watching, judging, whispering behind her back. They think I'm your mistress, she told Colt after their third trip into town. They were riding back in the wagon, the twins asleep in the back under a pile of blankets. Colt's jaw tightened. Let them think what they want. It doesn't bother you? Should it? We know the truth. That's all that matters. But Elara could tell it did bother him, the way it bothered her when women crossed the street to avoid her, or when the preacher's wife gave her a look that could have curdled milk. She'd been an outsider before, but this was different. This was a small community that had already decided what she was, and no amount of proper behavior was going to change their minds. The whispers got worse after the incident at the creek. Elara had taken the twins down to check on the water levels, something Colt did regularly to make sure the flow was still strong, when they'd encountered two men from a neighboring ranch. The men had been filling barrels, which wouldn't have been a problem, except that Colt had specifically told everyone that the creek was running low and people needed to reduce their usage until the spring thaw brought more water. You can't be here, Elara had said, stepping forward. Mr. Mercer made it clear. Mr. Mercer doesn't own the water, one of the men interrupted. He was older, with a weathered face and hostile eyes. Creek runs through multiple properties. We got as much right to it as he does. The creek starts on Mercer land, Elara said, trying to keep her voice steady. And during drought conditions, everyone agreed to rationing. We didn't agree to nothing, and we sure as hell don't take orders from Mercer's whore. The word hit her like a physical blow. She heard Lily gasp behind her, and that sound, that small, shocked intake of breath from a child who'd just heard her new friend called something ugly, made Elara angrier than the insult itself. Leave, she said, her voice shaking. Now. Or what? The man stepped closer, deliberately invading her space. You going to make us? What happened next wasn't something Elara planned. She'd spent years learning to keep her head down, to avoid confrontation, to survive by being invisible. But something about this moment, about standing there with two frightened children behind her, about being called that word, about all the accumulated injustice and fear and frustration of the past few weeks, made something inside her snap. She picked up a fallen branch, heavy and solid, and swung it at the nearest water barrel. The wood connected with a satisfying crack, and the barrel split open, water gushing out into the snow. Both men stared at her in shock. If you take water from this creek without permission, Elara said, raising the branch again, I'll destroy every barrel you try to fill, and then I'll report you to the sheriff for trespassing and theft. You wouldn't dare. She hit the second barrel. More water spilled out, wasted and steaming slightly in the cold air. Try me. The men looked at each other, clearly trying to decide if she was bluffing. Then they looked at the twins, who were watching with wide eyes, and apparently decided that fighting with a woman in front of children wasn't worth whatever point they were trying to make. They left, but not before the older one turned back and spat into the snow. Harlow's going to hear about this, he said, and when he does, you'll wish you'd kept your mouth shut. Elara stood there trembling as they rode off, adrenaline making her hands shake so badly she had to drop the branch. The twins ran to her immediately, wrapping themselves around her waist. That was amazing, Emma whispered, awed. That was stupid, Elara corrected, her voice unsteady. And dangerous. And you should never, ever do anything like that. But you did it, Lily pointed out. Yes, well, do as I say, not as I do. When they got back to the ranch and Elara told Colt what had happened, she expected him to be angry. Instead, he just looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression, and then said, You broke their barrels. Yes. Both of them. Yes. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I would have paid to see that. It's not funny, Elara said, even though she was fighting her own urge to smile. They called me, in front of your daughters, they called me, I know what they called you. The humor drained from his face. And they'll answer for it. But right now I need you to understand something. You can't keep confronting people like this. First Harlow, now this. You're making enemies faster than I can keep track of. They were stealing from you, and I would have handled it. That's my job, Elara, not yours. Your job is to take care of my daughters and stay safe while doing it. He ran his hand through his hair in frustration. You think I don't appreciate what you're trying to do? You think I don't see how hard you're working to protect this place? But I'm trying to protect you, and you keep throwing yourself into situations that could get you hurt or worse. I'm not some fragile thing that needs protecting, Elara shot back. I can take care of myself. Can you? Because from where I'm standing, you're one confrontation away from getting yourself killed, and those girls in there are going to be devastated if that happens. I'll be... He stopped abruptly, his jaw working like he was biting back words he didn't want to say. Just be more careful, please. The please did something to her anger, softened it into something more complicated. She could see the genuine fear in his eyes, and she realized that this wasn't about him doubting her capability. It was about him being terrified of losing someone else, and that terror making him overprotective in ways that probably frustrated him as much as they frustrated her. I'll try, she said quietly, but I can't promise I'll just stand by and watch when someone threatens this family. I'm not asking you to stand by, I'm asking you to be smart about it. Noted. They stood there in tense silence for a moment, and then William's voice called from inside, asking if anyone was going to help him with dinner or if he was expected to feed everyone single-handedly. The moment broke, and they went inside, but Elara could feel something had shifted between them. Some line had been crossed, some unspoken acknowledgement made. That night, she lay awake in her small room, listening to the house settle around her and thinking about what William had said. About Colt being dead inside until she'd agreed to stay. About her giving her word and whether she could actually keep it when things got harder. About whether she was building something real here or just delaying the inevitable moment when everything fell apart. She must have eventually fallen asleep because she woke to the sound of shouting. For a confused moment, she thought she was dreaming, but then she heard it again. Colt's voice, angry and urgent, and another voice responding with equal heat. She threw on her robe and hurried out into the main room. Colt was standing near the door, fully dressed despite the late hour, and there was a man with him she'd never seen before. He was younger than Colt, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Can't just ignore this, the stranger was saying. Harlow's called a town meeting, tomorrow night. He's going to make his case to the council for claiming water rights on your property. He can't do that, Colt said. The water rights were settled when my grandfather bought this land. He's got a lawyer coming up from the territorial capital. Says he's found an old treaty that supersedes property claims. Says the water belongs to whoever can prove they need it most for the good of the community. That's insane. Maybe. But half the town's on his side already. They're tired of rationing, tired of watching their crops die while your creek runs strong. Harlow's promising that if he controls the water, everyone gets equal access. Everyone except me, you mean? The stranger shifted uncomfortably. Look, Mercer, I'm just the messenger. Tom sent me to warn you because he figures you deserve to know what's coming. But you need to be prepared. This meeting could go badly. Who's Tom? Elara asked from the doorway. Both men turned to look at her, and the stranger's eyes widened slightly. You're the woman everyone's talking about. I suppose I am. Tom's my brother, Colt said. Runs a small operation about 10 miles south of here. He and Harlow have history. Bad history, the stranger, apparently Tom's messenger, added. Harlow tried to force Tom off his land 2 years ago. Didn't work, but it got ugly. Tom's no friend of yours, Mercer, but he's less of a friend to Harlow. Enemy of my enemy and all that. Tell Tom I said thanks for the warning, Colt said. And tell him if he wants to make a stand against Harlow, now would be the time. The messenger nodded and left, disappearing into the darkness outside. Colt stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, and Elara could see the tension radiating off him in waves. What does this mean? She asked. It means Harlow's done playing games. He's going to try to take the water rights legally, and if that works, he'll own us. Can't run a ranch without water. He turned to look at her. And before you ask, no, you're not coming to the meeting. It's going to be hostile enough without adding fuel to the fire. I'm coming, Elara said. Elara, you said this was my home now. That means I have a right to defend it same as you do. It also means I have a right to ask you not to put yourself in danger. Ask all you want. I'm still coming. They stared at each other, wills clashing in the dim light from the fireplace. Finally, Colt shook his head, something that might have been admiration crossing his face. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. Thank you. That wasn't a compliment. I'm taking it as one anyway. The next day passed in nervous preparation. William spent the morning cleaning his rifle, which seemed ominous. Colt went over the property deeds and water rights documents, making sure everything was in order. Elara tried to keep the twins distracted with lessons and games, but they could sense the tension in the house, and kept asking questions she didn't know how to answer. "Is Mr. Harlow going to take our home?" Lily asked at one point. "No," Elara said, with more confidence than she felt. "Your father won't let that happen." "But what if he can't stop it? What if the town says Mr. Harlow can have our water?" "Then we'll figure something else out. Your father's smart, and he's strong, and he loves you more than anything. He'll find a way." Emma was quieter than her sister, but Elara could see the fear in her eyes. That night, when she was tucking them into bed, Emma grabbed her hand. "You won't leave us, will you?" the girl whispered. "Even if things get bad?" "I won't leave," Elara promised, and even as she said it, she knew she meant it. Whatever happened at the town meeting, whatever Harlow did, whatever obstacles came their way, she wasn't going anywhere. The meeting was held in the largest building in Black Ridge, a community hall that usually hosted church services and town gatherings. By the time Colt, Elara, and William arrived, the place was already packed with people. Elara could feel every eye in the room turn toward them as they walked in, could hear the whispers starting up immediately. Harlow was standing at the front near a makeshift podium, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people in the room made in a year. Next to him was a thin man with spectacles and a leather briefcase, the lawyer, Elara assumed. The town council sat at a long table off to the side, looking uncomfortable with the whole situation. Colt chose seats near the back, positioning himself so he could see everyone and everything. William sat on his left, Elara on his right. She could feel the hostility in the room like something physical, and she had to fight the urge to leave, to spare herself the judgment and the anger. The meeting was called to order by the town mayor, a middle-aged man named Hutchins, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He gave a brief introduction, explaining that they were here to discuss water rights and usage in light of the ongoing drought, and then he turned the floor over to Harlow. "Thank you, Mayor," Harlow said, his voice smooth and confident. "I'll keep this simple because I know you're all busy people. Black Ridge is suffering. Our crops are dying, our cattle are weak, and our families are struggling. Meanwhile, the Mercer Ranch sits on the best water source in the county, and they refuse to share it fairly." "That's a lie," Colt said loudly. "I've allowed rationed access for anyone who asks." "Rationed access controlled by you," Harlow shot back. "You decide who gets water and when. You decide how much. And when people try to take what they need to survive, you have your hired woman destroy their equipment." Elara felt her face flush as everyone turned to look at her. So that story had spread. "Those men were stealing," Colt said, "taking more than their share during a drought. That's not about control. It's about survival for everyone." "Is it?" Harlow gestured to his lawyer. "Because according to territorial law, water rights can be contested if it can be proven that the current holder is not using the resource for the greatest public good. And I think we can all agree that one ranch hoarding water while the rest of us suffer is not the greatest public good." The lawyer stepped forward, opening his briefcase and pulling out documents. "I have here a legal analysis showing that the Mercer water rights are based on a homestead claim from 1847. However, subsequent territorial legislation in 1862 established that water rights must serve community needs in times of scarcity. The Mercers have failed to demonstrate adequate community service." "That's ridiculous," William growled. "We've been sharing water for decades." "Sharing at your discretion is not the same as guaranteed access," the lawyer said. "What Mr. Harlow is proposing is a legal transfer of water management to a neutral party, namely himself, who will ensure equitable distribution to all parties." "Neutral?" Colt laughed, harsh and bitter. "Harlow owns half the ranches in this county. There's nothing neutral about him controlling our water." "Mr. Mercer," Mayor Hutchins said, "please let them finish." Harlow smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Elara's skin crawl. "The reality is simple. The drought is getting worse. People are desperate, and the Mercers are standing in the way of a solution that would benefit everyone. Now, I'm prepared to be reasonable. I'll purchase the water rights, not the land, just the rights, for a fair price. The Mercers keep their ranch, and the community gets reliable water access. Everyone wins. Except we lose control of the one thing that makes this ranch viable," Colt said. "And I'm guessing that once you control the water, you'll find ways to make sure we can't access enough to keep operating. Then you'll wait for us to fail and buy the property for nothing." "That's a serious accusation," Harlow said, but there was no real denial in his voice. The room erupted into argument, people shouting over each other about fairness and law and survival. Elara sat there watching it unfold, watching Colt try to make his case, while Harlow systematically demolished every argument. The lawyer kept citing laws and precedents, the council kept looking more and more convinced, and the townspeople kept nodding along with Harlow's rhetoric about the greater good. They were going to lose. Elara could see it happening in real time. Harlow had orchestrated this perfectly. He'd turned the community against the Mercers, made them look like selfish hoarders, and positioned himself as the reasonable solution. The council was going to rule in his favor, and there was nothing Colt could say to stop it. She stood up before she could second-guess herself. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent, everyone turning to look at her. She could feel Colt tense beside her, could sense William's displeasure, but she kept going. "Mr. Harlow talks about the greater good," she said, "about community and fairness and making sure everyone survives. That all sounds wonderful, but I've been living at the Mercer Ranch for almost 2 months now, and I've seen how this community actually treats the Mercers. I've watched people spit in the snow when they walk past. I've heard the rumors and the whispers. I've been called names I won't repeat in this room. And through all of it, the Mercers have continued to share their water with anyone who asks politely and follows the rationing rules. We're not here to discuss social acceptance," Harlow said. "We're here to discuss water rights." "No, we're here because you want to destroy a family that refuses to sell to you," Elara shot back. "This has nothing to do with the community and everything to do with your personal vendetta. You want their land, and you've decided that if you can't buy it, you'll take it piece by piece until there's nothing left." "That's slander," the lawyer said. "Is it? Then let me ask the room something." She turned to face the crowd. "How many of you have actually been denied water access by the Mercers? Not rationed, denied entirely. How many?" Silence. A few people shifted uncomfortably, but no hands went up. "Now let me ask a different question. How many of you have had Mr. Harlow approach you about selling your land, about joining his empire or getting out of his way?" This time several hands went up, slowly, reluctantly. "And how many of those offers came with implied threats? Suggestions that it would be easier to sell than to resist?" More hands. The mayor was watching this with wide eyes, clearly not expecting this turn. "See, here's what I think is happening," Elara continued. "I think Mr. Harlow has built his power by intimidation and manipulation, and I think the Mercer Ranch is the last major holdout in this county. If he can break them, he controls everything, and you're all helping him do it because you're scared of him." "This is outrageous," Harlow said, his smooth facade finally cracking. "Mayor, are you going to let this woman make baseless accusations?" "Are they baseless?" Elara challenged. "Because I'm happy to repeat everything in front of a territorial judge if you'd like. In fact, I'm happy to write to the territorial governor about what's happening in Black Ridge, about how one man is systematically taking control of an entire region through legal manipulation and threats." The threat hung in the air, and she could see Harlow processing it, calculating whether she was bluffing. The truth was, she had no idea if writing to the territorial governor would do any good, but the fact that Harlow looked worried suggested it might. "I move we table this discussion," one of the council members said suddenly, "until we can get proper legal review of all the claims being made." "Seconded," another one added quickly. Mayor Hutchins looked relieved. "All in favor?" The vote was unanimous. Harlow looked furious, but there was nothing he could do. The meeting was adjourned and people started filing out, many of them avoiding Elara's eyes as they passed. Colt grabbed her arm as soon as they were outside. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, but there was no real anger in his voice. He looked shocked, impressed, and terrified all at once. "I was thinking they were about to take everything from you," Elara said, "and somebody needed to fight back." "You just made an enemy of the most powerful man in the county." "I know. He's going to come after you now, personally." "I know that too." Colt stared at her, and then suddenly he was pulling her into a hug, fierce and unexpected. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the craziest," he said against her hair. "Possibly both." Elara hugged him back, her heart pounding. "Probably both," she admitted. They rode home in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. William kept glancing at her with something that might have been approval, and Colt kept his hand on her shoulder like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. When they got back to the ranch, the twins were still awake despite the late hour, waiting anxiously by the fire. They ran to their father immediately, asking what happened, if everything was okay, if they could stay. "We're fine," Colt told them. "Everything's fine, thanks to Miss Quinn." The girls turned to look at her, and Emma said quietly, "You saved us." "Not yet," Elara said, "but I'm going to try." Because that was the truth of it. She'd bought them time, not victory. Harlow was still out there, still dangerous, still determined to take what they had. The fight wasn't over. It had barely begun. But for the first time since she'd arrived at that cold train station, Elara felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. Like she'd finally found something worth fighting for, even if the fighting might destroy her. She was home. And she was staying. The retaliation came 3 days later in the form of fire. Elara was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she heard Lily scream. Not the playful shriek of a child at play, but genuine terror that made her blood freeze. She dropped the knife she'd been using and ran outside, and what she saw made her stumble to a halt. The barn was on fire. Thick black smoke was pouring from the upper windows, and she could already see flames licking through gaps in the wooden walls. The horses inside were screaming, high-pitched sounds of panic that cut through everything else. Colt was already there, trying to get the main doors open while William ran for buckets. The twins stood frozen near the house, holding each other and crying. "Get them inside," Colt shouted when he saw Elara. "Now!" But Elara was already moving toward the barn, not away from it. She could hear the horses, could imagine them trapped and terrified, and every instinct she had said she couldn't just stand by and do nothing. "Elara, no!" Colt grabbed her arm as she passed him. "It's too dangerous. The horses, I'll get them out. Take care of my daughters." She wanted to argue, but she could see the fear in his eyes, the absolute terror that she might get hurt trying to help. So she forced herself to turn away, to run back to the twins and gather them in her arms and carry them into the house despite their protests. Through the window, she watched Colt and William fight the fire, watched Colt disappear into the smoke and come back leading terrified horses, his face black with soot. Watched William throwing bucket after bucket of water that seemed to do nothing against the hungry flames. Watched the structure that had stood for generations start to collapse. "Is Papa going to be okay?" Emma whispered against Elara's shoulder. "Yes," Elara said, praying she wasn't lying. "Yes, he's going to be fine." But she wasn't sure. The fire was spreading faster than they could fight it, and Colt kept going back in, kept trying to save whatever he could, even as the roof started to cave. When he finally staggered out for the last time, smoke-stained and coughing, she felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was clenched tight. They lost the barn. By the time the fire burned itself out, there was nothing left but a smoking ruin and the acrid smell of burned wood. The horses were safe, all 4 of them, but everything else was gone. The hay stores, the equipment, the tools, the spare lumber they'd been saving for spring repairs. Gone. Colt stood there, staring at the wreckage, his face unreadable. William had his hand on his son's shoulder, and neither of them said anything. The twins had stopped crying and were just holding Elara's hands, their small fingers gripping tight. "It was Harlow," William said finally, his voice rough with smoke and rage. "Had to be." "You don't know that," Colt said. "Who else would it be? 3 days after that meeting and suddenly our barn catches fire? Could have been an accident. Lantern knocked over, spark from the forge." "Don't," William interrupted. "Don't make excuses for him. We both know what this is." Elara felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd known Harlow was dangerous, but burning down a barn? That crossed a line from intimidation into something much darker. What if the twins had been in there? What if Colt hadn't gotten the horses out in time? "We should report it to the sheriff," she said. Both men looked at her, and she could see resignation in their faces. "Sheriff's on Harlow's payroll," William said. "Has been for years. Even if we reported it, nothing would happen. Probably just make things worse." "So we do nothing? We just let him destroy everything we have piece by piece?" "We rebuild," Colt said quietly. "That's what we do. We survive, and we rebuild. And we don't give him the satisfaction of watching us break." He walked away then, heading toward the house, and Elara could see the exhaustion in every line of his body. The twins followed him, but William stayed behind with her, both of them staring at the ruined barn. "This is because of what you said at that meeting," William told her. It wasn't an accusation exactly, just a statement of fact. You embarrassed him in front of the whole town, made him look weak. Men like Harlow don't forgive that. So what was I supposed to do? Let him take the water rights? Maybe. Maybe that would have been smarter than painting a target on all our backs. He sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 60-some years. But what's done is done. Now we deal with the consequences. The consequences came in waves over the next several weeks. First it was the barn, then it was fence lines cut in the night, letting half their cattle wander off into the wilderness. Then it was the water. Someone dumped something upstream that killed fish and made the creek run brown and foul for 2 days. Each incident was carefully orchestrated to look like it could have been an accident or bad luck, but the pattern was clear. Harlow was making his point. The town turned even more hostile. People who'd been merely unfriendly before became openly aggressive. Someone threw a rock through the general store window after they saw Elara inside, and the owner banned her from the premises even though she'd had nothing to do with it. The preacher gave a sermon about outsiders bringing trouble to peaceful communities. Children threw snowballs at the twins when Elara took them into town, and when she complained, their parents just shrugged. "Maybe you should leave," one mother said, not unkindly. "Things were fine before you came." Elara wanted to scream that things weren't fine, that Harlow had been terrorizing this town long before she arrived, that they were all too scared to stand up to him, so they were taking out their fear on the nearest target. But she didn't. She just took the twins' hands and walked back to the wagon, trying to ignore the whispers that followed them. The money situation was getting desperate too. Without the barn, they couldn't properly shelter the animals or store supplies. Rebuilding would cost more than they had, especially with the lost cattle income. Colt started taking on extra work, hiring himself and William out to neighboring ranches, doing repairs and odd jobs that took them away from their own property for days at a time. Which meant Elara was often alone with the twins, trying to maintain what was left of the ranch, while looking over her shoulder constantly. She'd never been so exhausted or so frightened in her life. "We could ask Tom for help," William suggested one night after another failed attempt to fix a section of collapsed fence. "He's got the manpower and the equipment." "No," Colt said flatly. "Pride's going to get us killed." "It's not pride. Tom's help comes with strings attached. You know that as well as I do. The moment I accept his assistance, he'll own part of this ranch." Better him than Harlow. Better neither of them. They were in the main room, the twins asleep upstairs, and Elara was mending a shirt by firelight. She'd been trying not to listen to their argument, but it was impossible not to hear the desperation creeping into both their voices. "We can't keep going like this," William said. "Every day something new breaks down or gets sabotaged. We're hemorrhaging money and resources, and there's no end in sight. You need to accept that we might not be able to hold on." "We're holding on," Colt insisted. "We're surviving. For how long? Another month? 2? What happens when we can't afford to feed the animals, let alone ourselves? What happens when the twins start going hungry because we can't buy supplies?" "That's not going to happen." "You don't know that." William's voice rose, frustration finally breaking through. "You're so busy being stubborn that you can't see we're drowning." "Then what do you want me to do?" Colt shouted back. "Sell to Harlow? Give up everything my father and grandfather built? Teach my daughters that you should just surrender when things get hard? I want you to be realistic. I want you to put those girls first instead of this damn ranch." The silence that followed was heavy and painful. Elara set down her mending, unsure whether to stay or give them privacy. But before she could decide, Colt stood up and walked out, slamming the door behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. William sat there for a moment, breathing hard, and then he noticed Elara watching. "You should go talk to him," the old man said. "He'll listen to you." "I'm not sure that's true." "It's more true than you think." William stood, moving toward the stairs. "Just try to make him see reason, before there's nothing left to save." Elara found Colt in what was left of the barn, sitting on a charred beam and staring out at the darkness. He didn't look up when she approached, but he didn't tell her to leave either. "He's right, you know," she said quietly, sitting down next to him. "Your father." "I know." "Then why us?" "Because this is all I have left of her," Colt interrupted, his voice rough. "My wife. She loved this place. She grew up in a city, came out here because she thought frontier life would be romantic and exciting, and it was anything but. It was hard and lonely and dangerous, but she made it home anyway. She planted gardens and painted the walls and sang while she worked, and she turned this place from just a ranch into somewhere worth living. When she died, I promised her I wouldn't let it fall apart, that I'd keep it going for the girls, so they'd always have this connection to her. Elara felt tears prick her eyes. She wouldn't want you to sacrifice your daughter's future for a promise. Wouldn't she? You didn't know her. She was stubborn as hell, believed in fighting for what mattered. She would have stood up to Harlow without hesitation. Maybe. But she also would have wanted her children safe and happy, even if that meant leaving. Colt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What about you? Do you want to leave?" The question caught her off guard. What? You've been here through all of this. The fire, the sabotage, the town turning against us. You've taken as much abuse as anyone, maybe more, and you don't owe us anything. You could leave tomorrow, find work somewhere else, somewhere safer. So I'm asking, do you want to leave? Elara thought about it. She thought about the train station where this had all started, about the desperation and loneliness that had brought her here. She thought about the twins and their trust, about William's gruff respect, about Colt himself and the way he made her feel like she mattered. She thought about standing up in that town meeting, about breaking those water barrels, about all the small acts of defiance that had felt like finding herself after years of just surviving. "No," she said, "I don't want to leave." "Why not?" "Because for the first time in my life, I have something worth staying for. Something worth fighting for, even when the fighting gets hard and scary and maybe stupid." She looked at him. "You asked me once why I came out here. The truth is I was running away from a life where I didn't matter to anyone, where I was just another poor woman trying to survive in a world that didn't care if I lived or died. But here I matter. To your daughters, to your father, and whether you'll admit it or not, to you. So no, I don't want to leave, even if staying means watching everything fall apart." Colt reached over and took her hand, his palm rough and warm against hers. "I'm glad you're here," he said quietly. "Even with everything that's happened, I'm glad." They sat there in the ruins of the barn, holding hands and not talking, and Elara felt something shift between them, something that had been building since the moment he'd found her at that train station, through all the days and weeks of working together and fighting together and surviving together. She wasn't sure what to call it, but it felt important and terrifying and inevitable all at once. The moment was broken by a sound, hoofbeats, multiple horses, coming fast. They both stood up immediately, and Colt's hand went to the rifle he'd started carrying everywhere. Through the darkness, they could see lights approaching, torches held by riders. "Get inside," Colt said. "Wake my father. Get the girls ready to move if necessary." "What are you going to do?" "Whatever I have to." Elara wanted to argue, but she could see the determination in his face. So she ran back to the house, her heart pounding. She woke William first, and he was up and armed within seconds. Then she went to the twins' room, trying to be quiet, trying not to scare them. "What's happening?" Emma asked sleepily when Elara shook her shoulder. "We might have visitors. I need you and Lily to get dressed and stay quiet. Can you do that for me?" Both girls nodded, suddenly wide awake and frightened. Elara helped them dress, her hands shaking slightly, and then she positioned them near the back door where they could run if necessary. William stood by the front window, rifle ready, watching the approaching riders. "How many?" Elara whispered. 7, maybe 8, too dark to be sure. The riders stopped in the yard, their torches casting flickering shadows across the snow. Colt stood on the porch, his rifle visible but not raised, and Elara could hear voices but not words. The conversation went on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then the riders turned and left, and Colt came back inside, his face grim. "What did they want?" William demanded. "That was Tom. My brother." Colt set his rifle down carefully. "He says Harlow's planning something big. An attack, probably within the week. Tom heard it from one of Harlow's men who got drunk and started bragging. He came to warn us and to make an offer." "What kind of offer?" "Protection. Men, weapons, whatever we need, in exchange for water rights to the northern section of the property." "That's nearly a quarter of our land," William said. I know. And you told him? I told him I'd think about it. Elara could see the war happening behind Colt's eyes, pride and desperation fighting each other. What kind of attack? She asked. He didn't know specifics, but if Harlow's bringing enough men that it's worth bragging about, it's not going to be another barn fire. This is something bigger. Then you have to accept Tom's help, Elara said. You can't fight off multiple armed men by yourself. I'm not by myself. I have my father, and I have... He stopped, looking at her, and she could see him realize what he was about to say, that he had her, that she'd somehow become part of his fighting force, as absurd as that was. You have 2 old men and a woman who doesn't know how to shoot, Elara finished for him, against however many men Harlow can afford to hire. That's not a fight you can win, Colt. That's suicide. She's right, William said reluctantly. Tom's offer might be the only way we survive this. And what happens after? We give him the water rights, and then what? He starts making demands for more? Eventually we're working for him instead of ourselves? Maybe. But at least we're alive and the girls are safe. That's got to count for something. The argument continued back and forth, neither of them willing to give ground. Elara finally took the twins back upstairs and tried to get them settled, but they were too scared and upset to sleep. So she sat with them, telling quiet stories and stroking their hair, while below she could hear the men's voices rising and falling. She must have dozed off at some point because she woke to find early morning light coming through the window and both twins asleep against her. Her neck ached from the awkward angle, and her legs were numb from staying in one position too long. She carefully extracted herself and went downstairs to find Colt sitting alone at the table, staring at nothing. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. "No." "And your decision?" "I'm going to talk to Tom today. See if I can negotiate terms that don't completely sell us out." He looked up at her, exhausted and defeated. "You were right. I can't protect everyone alone. I need help, even if accepting that help costs me." Elara wanted to say something comforting, but she couldn't find the words, so she just started making breakfast, and they sat in silence while the rest of the house slowly woke up. Colt left after breakfast, riding out to meet Tom at some prearranged location. He took William with him, which meant Elara was alone with the twins when the next disaster struck. She was hanging laundry when she heard it, a shout followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. She dropped the sheet she'd been holding and ran toward the sound, the twins following behind her. What she found made her stomach drop. One of the horses was down, thrashing in the snow, foam coming from its mouth. The other horses in the temporary corral were panicking, trying to get away from their fallen companion. Elara could see immediately that something was wrong, that this wasn't just an injury or illness. "Stay back," she told the twins, but they were already backing away, frightened by the horse's distress. She approached carefully, trying to assess the situation. The horse's eyes were rolling, its breathing labored. There was vomit in the snow nearby, and a half-eaten pile of hay that smelled wrong, chemical, artificial. Poison. Someone had poisoned the feed. Elara felt rage rise up in her, hot and choking. This was beyond intimidation, beyond property damage. This was cruel and deliberate, designed to cause suffering. She knelt next to the horse, stroking its neck, trying to offer some comfort as it died because there was nothing else she could do. It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of watching an innocent animal suffer and die while the twins cried, and Elara felt more helpless than she'd ever felt in her life. When it was finally over, she stood up on shaking legs and turned to find both girls clinging to each other, their faces streaked with tears. "Is Buttercup dead?" Lily whispered. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm sorry." "Why? What happened to her?" Elara couldn't tell them the truth, that someone had deliberately poisoned their horse to hurt their family. So she said, "She got sick. Sometimes that happens, and there's nothing we can do to stop it." "Are the other horses going to get sick too?" "I don't think so, but we need to be careful." She spent the rest of the morning checking the other feed supplies, throwing out anything that looked or smelled suspicious. The remaining 3 horses seemed fine, but she couldn't be sure. She couldn't be sure of anything anymore. When Colt and William returned that afternoon, they found her in the yard with the twins, all of them sitting near the dead horse. Colt took one look at the scene and his face went white. "What happened?" he asked, already knowing. "The feed was poisoned," Elara said flatly. "I checked everything else. I think it was just the one pile, but I can't be certain. Colt knelt down next to the horse, running his hand over its neck. This had been his wife's favorite, Elara realized. The horse she'd ridden when she was pregnant with the twins. The one she'd named something silly and sweet. And now it was dead because someone wanted to hurt this family. "Did you reach an agreement with Tom?" Elara asked quietly. "Yes." Colt stood up, his movements mechanical. "He's sending men tomorrow. They'll patrol the property, watch for intruders, in exchange for water rights to the northern section and a percentage of our cattle sales for the next 5 years. That's a steep price. It's survival." He looked at her, and she could see something breaking in his eyes. "I thought accepting his help would make things better, but it won't, will it? Harlow's not going to stop. He's just going to keep escalating until there's nothing left or someone's dead." "Then we make him stop," Elara heard herself say. Both men looked at her. "How?" William asked. "I don't know yet. But there has to be a way. There has to be something we can do that's not just enduring, not just waiting for the next attack and hoping we survive it." "You got any suggestions? I'm listening," Colt said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. Elara thought about it. She thought about the town meeting, about the way people had reacted when she'd challenged Harlow publicly. She thought about the whispers and the gossip, about how much this community seemed to thrive on secrets and reputation. And slowly, an idea began to form. "What if we expose him?" she said. "Not just his threats against you, but everything. Every ranch he's forced out, every dirty deal he's made, every law he's broken or bent. What if we gather evidence and take it to the territorial governor like I threatened at the meeting?" "We don't have evidence," William pointed out. "Everything he's done is designed to look like accidents or business transactions." "So we get evidence. We talk to people. We document everything. We build a case that's too big to ignore." "That would take time," Colt said. "Time we might not have. Then we buy time. Tom's men will help with that. And while they're watching the property, we focus on gathering information." "Nobody's going to talk to us," William said. "The whole town's against us." "They're not against us. They're scared of Harlow. There's a difference." Elara stood up, feeling conviction settle in her chest. "People like Tom, who've been hurt by Harlow in the past, they'll talk. And once we have a few stories, others might come forward. Fear only works if people think they're alone. We just need to show them they're not." Colt studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "You realize if we do this and fail, it'll be worse than anything Harlow's done so far." "Yes." "And you still want to try?" "Yes." He looked at his father, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, William nodded. "Might as well go down fighting," the old man said. "Better than just waiting for the axe to fall." "All right," Colt said. "We try it your way. But the moment it looks like you're in danger, we stop. The twins can't lose anyone else." Agreed. They buried the horse that evening, all of them together, even the twins. It felt important somehow, acknowledging this loss, this cruelty, before they started fighting back. As they shoveled dirt over the grave, Elara found herself making a silent promise to the animal and to this family. She was going to find a way to stop Harlow. She was going to protect these people she'd come to love. And she wasn't going to run, no matter how bad things got. The next morning, Tom's men arrived. There were 6 of them, rough-looking cowboys who treated this assignment like a job rather than a favor. They set up a rotation. 2 men always watching different sections of the property while the others slept or ate. Their presence was both reassuring and unnerving, proof that the threat was real enough to need armed guards. Colt and Elara started their investigation that same day. They rode out to visit neighboring ranches, looking for anyone willing to talk about Harlow's business practices. Most people slammed doors in their faces. A few were more polite but still refused to say anything. But slowly, painfully, they began to find people who'd been hurt badly enough that they were willing to speak up. There was a widow whose husband had died under suspicious circumstances after refusing to sell his land. A former ranch hand who'd been beaten for talking about Harlow's illegal water diversion. A merchant who'd been driven out of business when Harlow threatened to blacklist anyone who traded with him. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, another count in the case they were building. Elara documented everything, writing it all down in careful detail with dates and names and specifics. She'd never done anything like this before, but she threw herself into it with desperate focus, driven by the knowledge that this might be their only chance. The work took weeks, long cold days of writing and talking and writing. While back at the ranch, the twins waited anxiously, and Tom's men kept watch. There were more incidents, fences cut, equipment damaged, threatening messages left where they'd be found. But nothing as devastating as the fire or the poisoning. Harlow seemed to be holding back, maybe because of Tom's men, maybe because he was planning something bigger. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One night, a man showed up at the ranch after dark, nervous and glancing over his shoulder constantly. He worked for Harlow, he said, but he was done with the violence, done with watching innocent people get hurt. He had documents, real, physical evidence of fraud and bribery and illegal land seizures, proof that would stand up in court if they could get it in front of someone who mattered. "Why are you doing this?" Elara asked him, hardly daring to believe what he was offering. "Because I got kids too," the man said simply, "and I don't want them growing up thinking this is how the world works. That might makes right, and good people should just shut up and take it." He handed over the documents and left before anyone could thank him properly. Colt and Elara spread the papers across the table, reading by lamplight, and with each page the case against Harlow became more damning. Financial records showing bribes paid to the sheriff and town council, contracts with illegal clauses that trapped ranchers into deals they couldn't escape. Even a letter discussing the barn fire, not quite admitting responsibility but getting close enough. "This is it," Colt said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is enough." "Enough for what?" William asked, appearing in the doorway. "Enough to bring him down. If we can get this to the territorial governor, if we can make it public, then we need to move fast," William interrupted. "Once Harlow realizes these documents are missing, he'll come for us with everything he has." "I'll ride out tomorrow," Colt said. "Take the documents to the territorial capital, hand-deliver them to the governor's office." "That's a 3-day ride each way," Elara said. "You'll be vulnerable the whole time." "Can't be helped. These documents are too important to trust to anyone else." "Then I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not. I need you here with the girls. William can watch the girls, and Tom's men are here for protection. You need someone watching your back on the road, and I'm the only person you can trust completely." She held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm coming with you, Colt. Don't bother arguing." He looked like he wanted to argue anyway, but William cut in. "She's right. 2 riders are safer than 1, especially if Harlow figures out what you're doing and sends men after you." Colt looked between them, clearly unhappy, but unable to find a good counterargument. "Fine," he said finally. "We leave at first light. Pack light and warm. It's going to be cold." That night, Elara barely slept. She kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong, all the ways this plan could fall apart. But she also thought about the twins, about the ranch, about the life she'd built here against all odds. She'd come west with nothing, and now she had everything to lose, which meant she had everything to fight for. When dawn came, she was ready. The twins were already awake when Elara came downstairs, both of them sitting at the table with red-rimmed eyes that said they'd been crying. Lily's face crumpled when she saw Elara, and she ran over and wrapped her arms around Elara's waist. "Don't go," the girl whispered. "Please don't go." Elara knelt down so she was at eye level with both of them. "I have to. Your father needs help, and this is important." "But what if something happens to you?" Emma asked, her voice small and frightened. "What if you don't come back?" "I'll come back, I promise." "That's what Mama said," Lily said, and the words hit Elara like a punch to the chest. She said she'd be fine, and then she wasn't. Elara pulled both girls close, feeling their small bodies shake with fear and grief that was still too big for them to fully understand. "I'm not your mother," she said gently, "and I can't promise that nothing bad will ever happen. But I can promise that I'm going to do everything in my power to come back to you. Because you two are the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time, and I'm not giving that up without a fight." William appeared in the doorway, his expression softer than Elara had ever seen it. "Come on, girls," he said. "Let's make breakfast for your father and Miss Quinn. They'll need food for the journey." The twins reluctantly let go, and Elara stood up feeling shaky. She'd meant what she said. She would fight to come back. But the truth was she had no idea what they were riding into, whether Harlow already knew about the missing documents, whether this whole trip was going to end in disaster before they even reached the territorial capital. Colt came in as they were finishing breakfast, fully armed and carrying saddlebags packed with supplies. He looked at his daughters, and something passed between them that didn't need words. Then he knelt down and held them both, whispering things Elara couldn't hear but could guess at. Promises, reassurances, love. When he stood up, William handed him a rifle. Take this too. Better to have it and not need it. You'll need it here. We have Tom's men and 2 other rifles. You take this one. William's voice left no room for argument. Then he turned to Elara and handed her a pistol. You know how to use this? No, Elara admitted. Point at what you want to shoot, pull the trigger. Don't hesitate if it comes to that, because whoever you're aiming at won't hesitate either. He showed her quickly how to load and unload it, where the safety was, how to hold it properly. Keep it in your coat pocket where you can reach it fast. Hope you never need it, but better safe than sorry. Elara took the gun with trembling hands, the weight of it foreign and frightening. She'd never held a weapon before, had never imagined a situation where she'd need to. But things had changed. She'd changed. The woman who'd sat alone at that train station would never have ridden off into danger armed and determined. But that woman didn't exist anymore. They left as the sun was breaking over the horizon, riding out with the documents wrapped in oilcloth and tucked safely in Colt's saddlebags. The plan was simple. 3 days hard riding to the territorial capital, deliver the documents to the governor's office with enough testimony to make sure they couldn't be ignored, and 3 days back. A week total, maybe less if they pushed hard and the weather held. The first day passed without incident. They rode through country that was beautiful in its harshness, all white snow and dark trees and mountains rising in the distance. Colt kept them moving at a steady pace that ate up miles without exhausting the horses. They stopped briefly for lunch, eating jerky and hard bread while the horses rested and then pushed on until dusk. That night they made camp in a sheltered spot off the main trail, building a small fire for warmth and taking turns keeping watch. Elara took the first shift, sitting wrapped in blankets with the pistol in her lap, listening to the night sounds and trying not to imagine threats in every shadow. You can't stay awake the whole time, Colt said, appearing next to her so quietly she nearly jumped. I'm supposed to be on watch. Couldn't sleep. He sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. Worried? Terrified, actually. She looked at him. What if this doesn't work? What if the governor doesn't care, or Harlow gets to him first, or the documents aren't enough? Then we tried. That's more than most people do. He was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. I never thanked you properly. For everything you've done. For staying when you could have left, for standing up to Harlow, for pushing me to fight back instead of just enduring. My daughters love you. My father respects you, which is saying something. And I... He trailed off, seeming to struggle with the words. You what? Elara asked softly. I've been dead for 3 years, he said finally. Going through the motions, taking care of the girls and the ranch, but not really living, just surviving. And then you showed up, and suddenly I had a reason to do more than just survive. You made me want to fight for something again, not just protect what I had left, but actually build something better. I don't know what that means or where it goes, but I wanted you to know. Elara felt tears threaten. I was drowning back east, working myself to death in jobs that barely paid enough to eat, living in rooms with too many other desperate women, watching myself disappear a little more every day. I thought coming west would give me a fresh start. And when that fell apart, I thought I was finished. Done. But you gave me something I'd never had before, a place where I mattered, where I wasn't just another body-filling space, but an actual person who could make a difference. So whatever happens with Harlow, whatever comes next, I need you to know that this has already been worth it. Colt reached over and took her hand, and they sat there like that for a long time, not saying anything more, just being together in the cold darkness. Eventually, Elara dozed off, despite her intentions, and when she woke, Colt had covered her with an extra blanket and was keeping watch alone. The second day was harder. The weather turned, bringing wind that cut through their coats and snow that made the trail treacherous. They had to slow down, picking their way carefully through drifts and around ice patches. By nightfall, they'd covered less distance than Colt had hoped, and his frustration was evident. We're not going to make it in 3 days at this rate, he said as they made camp. So we make it in 4. Does it matter? Every day we're gone is another day the twins are in danger. Every day gives Harlow more time to figure out what we're doing. William and Tom's men will keep them safe, and we're doing the only thing that has a chance of actually stopping Harlow permanently. That's worth an extra day. Colt didn't argue, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the fear that something would go wrong while he was too far away to help. She understood it because she felt it too, that constant low-level anxiety that had become her companion since the barn fire. They reached the territorial capital late on the fourth day, both of them exhausted and saddle-sore. The city was bigger than Black Ridge by an order of magnitude, with actual paved streets and buildings that rose 2 and 3 stories. There were people everywhere despite the late hour, and the noise and activity felt overwhelming after weeks in the relative isolation of the ranch. The governor's office was closed for the night, which meant they had to find a hotel and wait until morning. Colt got them 2 rooms despite Elara's protest that they should save money, and she was too tired to argue much. She collapsed onto the bed fully clothed and was asleep within minutes. Morning came too early. They ate a quick breakfast and headed to the government building, an imposing structure that made Elara feel small and insignificant. Inside, they were directed to an office on the 2nd floor where a secretary informed them that the governor was in meetings all day and couldn't see anyone without an appointment. "This is urgent," Colt said. "We have evidence of corruption and fraud affecting multiple counties." "I'm sure it is urgent, sir. Everyone who comes here thinks their issue is urgent." The secretary gave them a practiced, sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The earliest appointment I can offer is next Tuesday." "That's 6 days from now," Elara protested. "Yes, ma'am. The governor is a very busy man." They argued for another 20 minutes, getting nowhere. The secretary was polite but immovable, clearly used to dealing with desperate people making demands. Finally, Colt pulled Elara aside. "We're not getting through this way," he said quietly. "We need a different approach." "Like what?" "We find someone else who can help, a territorial judge, a marshal, someone with authority who isn't buried under bureaucracy." They spent the rest of the day navigating government offices and getting passed from person to person. Most officials took one look at them, dusty and travel-worn and clearly from the frontier, and found reasons they couldn't help. A few were more sympathetic but equally powerless. By evening, Elara was ready to scream from frustration. "There has to be someone," she said as they sat in yet another waiting room. "Someone who actually cares about justice more than protecting their position. In my experience, people like that are rare," Colt said. "Especially in government." But Elara refused to give up. She'd come too far, fought too hard to let bureaucratic indifference stop her now. So she started talking to everyone she could find, clerks, guards, other people waiting in offices, asking if anyone knew of an official who actually listened to complaints from ordinary citizens. The name that kept coming up was Judge Adelaide Ross. "She's tough," one clerk told Elara. "Doesn't care who you are or how much money you have. She cares about the law, and she hates corruption. If anyone will listen to you, it's her." Judge Ross's office was in a different building, smaller and less impressive than the governor's. Her secretary was an older woman who looked at them with sharp, assessing eyes. "You have evidence?" she asked after Colt explained why they were there. "Yes, ma'am. Documents showing fraud, bribery, illegal land seizures, and conspiracy to commit violence." "And you're willing to testify under oath to the authenticity of these documents and the events surrounding them?" "Absolutely." The secretary disappeared into an inner office and came back a few minutes later. "Judge Ross will see you now." The judge herself was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and the kind of face that suggested she'd seen everything humanity had to offer and wasn't impressed. She gestured for them to sit and then held out her hand for the documents. She read in silence for nearly an hour while Elara and Colt sat there barely breathing. Elara watched the judge's expression change from neutral to concerned to outright angry. When she finally set the papers down, her eyes were hard. "This man, Harlow, he controls the sheriff in your county?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Colt said. "And members of the town council?" "At least half of them, maybe more." "Which means local law enforcement is compromised and you had nowhere else to turn." Judge Ross tapped the documents thoughtfully. "These are serious allegations. If even half of this is true, Mr. Harlow has broken multiple territorial laws and should be arrested and prosecuted." "If," Elara said. "Your Honor, every word of that is true. We have witnesses, we have documentation." "I believe you, Miss Quinn, but believing you and having enough evidence to convict in court are two different things. What you've brought me is a good start, but I'll need more. Sworn testimony from the victims, corroboration of the financial records, evidence linking Harlow directly to the acts of violence." She looked at both of them seriously. "This is going to be a long process, months, possibly years. Are you prepared for that? Elara felt her heart sink. Months? Years? They didn't have that kind of time. Harlow would destroy the ranch long before a court case could play out, but Colt leaned forward, his voice steady. What if you issued a temporary injunction, something that would legally prevent Harlow from taking any action against our property while the investigation proceeds? Judge Ross considered this. I could do that. It would protect your water rights and prevent further harassment while I review the case. But understand that such an injunction would put Harlow on notice. He'll know you've taken this to a higher authority, and he'll likely respond aggressively. He's already responded aggressively, Elara said. He burned our barn, poisoned our horse, sabotaged our property repeatedly. We're not asking for protection from future harm. We're asking for justice for harm that's already been done and continues to happen. Something that might have been approval crossed the judge's face. I'll grant the injunction, and I'll assign a territorial marshal to your area to enforce it and gather additional evidence. With any luck, we'll have enough to arrest Harlow within a few weeks. And if we don't? Colt asked. Then you keep fighting, Mr. Mercer. You keep documenting every incident, gathering every piece of evidence, and trusting that the law will eventually catch up to the lawbreakers. It's not perfect, and it's not fast, but it's the best system we have. They left Judge Ross's office with the injunction document and a promise that a marshal would be dispatched to Black Ridge within days. It wasn't everything Elara had hoped for, but it was something. It was progress. It was hope. The ride back was faster than the journey out, fueled by urgency and the need to get home before Harlow could retaliate. They pushed hard, stopping only when absolutely necessary, and made the trip in 3.5 days instead of 4. When they finally rode onto Mercer property, Elara felt relief so intense it made her dizzy. The house was still standing, smoke rising from the chimney. The remaining horses were in the temporary corral, healthy and alert. And the twins came running out as soon as they heard the hoofbeats, shrieking with joy. Colt barely had time to dismount before his daughters threw themselves at him, and Elara watched with a lump in her throat as he held them and told them everything was going to be okay. Then Emma broke away and ran to Elara, and she found herself picking up the little girl and spinning her around. "You came back," Emma said, her voice muffled against Elara's shoulder. "I knew you would, but Lily was worried." "I was not," Lily protested, but she was smiling through tears. William emerged from the house, and the relief on his face was plain. "Any trouble?" "Not on the road," Colt said, "but we need to talk about what happens next." They gathered inside, and Colt explained about Judge Ross and the injunction and the marshal who was coming. William listened with his usual skeptical expression, and Tom's men, who'd gathered to hear the news, looked cautiously optimistic. "So what does this injunction actually do?" William asked. "It legally prohibits Harlow from taking any action against our property or water rights while the case is under investigation," Colt explained. "If he violates it, he can be arrested for contempt of court." "You think a piece of paper is going to stop him?" "No, but I think the threat of arrest and losing everything he's built might make him think twice, especially once the marshal arrives and starts gathering evidence. Or it might make him desperate enough to do something really stupid," William said. He was right to be worried. The injunction arrived via official courier 2 days later, and word spread through Black Ridge like wildfire. Elara was in town with the twins when she heard people talking about it, saw the looks of surprise and speculation. Some people seemed pleased, like they'd been waiting for someone to stand up to Harlow. Others looked frightened, like they knew what was coming and wanted no part of it. The retaliation came that night. Elara woke to the sound of shouting and gunfire. She grabbed the pistol William had given her and ran to the twins' room first, finding them already awake and terrified. She got them under the bed and told them to stay there no matter what, and then she ran downstairs. The main room was chaos. William was at one window with his rifle, Tom's men at others, all of them firing out into the darkness. Colt was loading weapons with quick, practiced movements, his face grim. "How many?" Elara asked. "At least 10, maybe more. They're trying to surround the house." He handed her a loaded rifle. "You remember what my father taught you? Point and shoot." "Close enough. Stay away from the windows and don't waste ammunition." The attack was brutal and coordinated. Harlow's men, she had no doubt that's who they were, kept up constant fire, trying to pin them down while others moved closer to the house. She could hear them shouting to each other, coordinating their assault, and the sound of breaking glass as bullets shattered windows. Elara found herself at a window, firing at shadows and shapes, not sure if she was hitting anything but determined to help. The rifle kicked against her shoulder hard enough to bruise, and the noise was deafening, but she kept loading and firing like William had shown her. Then she heard Colt shout a warning, and she turned to see flames. They'd set fire to the porch, and it was spreading fast toward the main structure. If they didn't put it out quickly, they'd lose the house just like they'd lost the barn. "Keep them pinned!" Colt yelled, grabbing a bucket of water they kept inside for drinking. He ran toward the fire, and Elara's heart stopped because he was exposed, vulnerable, and she could see men moving to take advantage. She didn't think. She just raised her rifle and fired at the nearest shape, and was shocked when she saw it go down. She fired again and again, giving Colt the cover he needed to reach the fire and start fighting it. Other men joined him, Tom's guards abandoning their windows to help save the house. The battle lasted maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. By the time Harlow's men finally pulled back, the porch was a smoking ruin, and there were bullet holes in every wall. 2 of Tom's men were wounded, one seriously, and Elara was shaking so badly she could barely stand. "Is everyone all right?" Colt asked, his voice hoarse from smoke. They did a quick count. Everyone was accounted for, even the twins who'd stayed hidden like Elara told them. The wounded men were being tended to. The fire was out. They'd survived. "He's going to come back," William said. "He's not going to stop." "No," Colt agreed, "but neither are we." The territorial marshal arrived the next morning, a tall man named Carson, who took one look at the damage and immediately started documenting everything. He interviewed everyone, examined the bullet casings, and made detailed notes about the attack. Then he rode into Black Ridge with Colt and came back with 3 of Harlow's men in custody. They talked, Carson told them that evening. Didn't even take much pressure. They admitted Harlow hired them for the attack, promised them money to drive you off the property. With their testimony plus the documents you already provided, I've got enough to arrest Harlow himself. "When?" Colt asked. "Now. Tonight. Before he has time to run or destroy more evidence." Elara wanted to go with them, wanted to see Harlow's face when he was arrested, but Carson wouldn't allow it. So she stayed at the ranch with the twins, pacing and worrying and trying not to imagine all the ways this could still go wrong. They came back after midnight. Carson had Harlow in chains, and the man looked nothing like the smooth, confident figure who'd threatened them so many times. He looked scared and angry and diminished, just another criminal being brought to justice. "It's over," Carson said. "He'll be tried in the territorial capital, and with the evidence we have, he'll be convicted. Your property is safe." Elara felt something release in her chest, some terrible tension she'd been carrying for months. It was really over. They'd won. The aftermath took weeks to fully unfold. Harlow's empire collapsed quickly once word spread of his arrest. Ranchers he'd been extorting came forward with their own stories. The sheriff resigned in disgrace. The town council was reorganized. Black Ridge started to feel like a real community again, instead of a place ruled by fear. The Mercer ranch slowly healed too. They rebuilt the barn with help from neighbors who suddenly felt safe offering assistance. They bought new cattle to replace the ones they'd lost. They fixed fences and repaired damage and started planning for spring planting. It was hard work, but it felt different now. It felt like building a future instead of just desperately trying to survive. Elara fell into a routine that felt almost normal. She taught the twins reading and arithmetic in the mornings, helped with ranch work in the afternoons, and spent evenings with the family doing ordinary things like cooking dinner and mending clothes and telling stories. It was the life she'd imagined when she'd first answered that advertisement, the life she'd thought she'd lost. One evening, about 2 months after Harlow's arrest, Colt found her on the porch watching the sunset. He sat down next to her, and they were quiet for a moment before he spoke. "The trial's in 3 weeks," he said, "in the territorial capital. They want us to testify." "Both of us?" "All of us. Me, you, my father, some of the other victims. They want to make sure he's convicted on everything they can prove." Elara nodded. She'd known this was coming, but it still felt surreal. "The twins? We'll stay with Tom's wife. She offered to watch them while we're gone." He paused. "I know testifying won't be easy, reliving everything, having to face Harlow again." "I'll do it," Elara interrupted. "Whatever it takes to make sure he can't hurt anyone else." Colt took her hand, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something I've been thinking about for a while now." "All right. When you first arrived, I thought I was helping you, giving you a place to stay, a job, a chance to get back on your feet. But the truth is, you saved us. You saved this ranch, you saved my daughters, and you saved me from a life where I was just going through the motions, waiting to die. You made us a family again." Elara felt tears starting. "Colt, let me finish. I know it's complicated. I know we've been through hell together, and maybe that's not the best foundation for what I'm about to ask. But I also know that I haven't felt this way since my wife died, and I don't want to let it pass without saying something." He turned to face her fully. "I love you, Elara Quinn, and I want you to stay here permanently. Not as an employee or a governess or someone just helping out. I want you to stay as my wife, if you'll have me." The words hung in the air between them, and Elara couldn't breathe. She thought about the woman who'd sat alone at that train station, certain her life was over. She thought about everything that had happened since, the fear and the fighting and the slow building of something that felt like home. She thought about the twins and their trust, about William and his gruff respect, about Colt himself and the way he'd given her a chance when no one else would. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, I'll marry you." Colt's face broke into a smile wider than she'd ever seen. And then he was kissing her, and she was kissing him back. And it felt like every hard thing they'd been through was worth it for this moment. The twins found them like that, and their delighted squeals could probably be heard in town. They ran over and threw their arms around both of them, already calling Elara Mama, like they'd been waiting for permission. William appeared in the doorway and gave them a satisfied nod, like he'd known this was coming all along. The trial happened on schedule, and it was as difficult as Elara had expected. She had to stand in front of a courtroom full of strangers and recount everything: the threats, the violence, the fear. She had to look at Harlow and speak calmly about the damage he'd caused. But she also got to watch as the judge reviewed all the evidence, as witness after witness corroborated the story, as Harlow's expensive lawyers failed to create reasonable doubt. The verdict came back guilty on all counts. Harlow was sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, and the judge made it clear that his property and assets would be seized to pay restitution to his victims. It was justice, real and final, and Elara felt something settle in her soul that had been restless since the day she'd arrived in Black Ridge. They got married in the spring, in a small ceremony at the ranch with just family and a few close friends. The twins were flower girls, wearing matching dresses and taking their job very seriously. William cried, though he'd deny it if anyone asked. Tom attended with his family and even gave a speech about how his brother had been a stubborn fool, but had apparently found someone even more stubborn, which everyone agreed was exactly what he needed. Elara wore a simple dress that she'd made herself, nothing fancy but clean and white and hers. When Colt took her hand and made his vows, she felt the weight of everything they'd survived together, every battle fought and won, every moment of fear transformed into strength. They'd built this together, this family, this life, this future that had seemed impossible just months ago. The ranch thrived after that. With Harlow gone and the community no longer living in fear, neighbors started working together in ways they hadn't in years. They shared resources, helped with major projects, looked out for each other's families. The Mercer Ranch became known as a place of hospitality and hard work, where anyone in need could find assistance. The twins grew up strong and confident, learning to ride and rope and manage livestock alongside their studies. They never forgot their birth mother. Elara made sure of that, keeping her memory alive through stories and photographs. But they loved Elara fiercely and never questioned that she was their family. They grew into young women who knew how to fight for what mattered, who understood that strength came in many forms, who believed that standing up to injustice was worth the cost. Years later, when people asked Elara about her life, about how she'd ended up on a frontier ranch married to a cowboy with 2 daughters she loved like her own, she'd think back to that cold night at the train station. She'd remember the desperation and the loneliness, the absolute certainty that she had nowhere left to go. And she'd think about how wrong she'd been. Because what she'd learned, what she wanted people to understand, was that sometimes our greatest moments of strength come from our greatest moments of weakness. That sometimes losing everything is what it takes to find what really matters. That family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who show up when you're at your worst and decide you're worth fighting for. She'd learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That standing up to bullies and tyrants is terrifying and necessary, and worth doing even when the odds seem impossible. That one person really can make a difference if they're willing to risk everything for what's right. But most of all, she had learned that home isn't a place you're born into or a destination you arrive at fully formed. Home is something you build with your own hands, alongside people who become your family through choice rather than circumstance. It's something you fight for and protect and nurture through good times and bad. It's messy and imperfect and real in ways that fairy tales never capture. The ranch spread out before her, the rebuilt barn, the healthy cattle, the creek running clear and strong through property that would someday belong to her daughters. Colt was out mending fence with William, their voices carrying across the distance. The twins were in the house practicing piano, the music drifting through open windows along with the smell of bread baking. This was her life now. Not the life she'd planned or the one she'd expected, but the one she'd earned through stubbornness and courage, and refusing to give up even when giving up seemed like the only option. She'd been abandoned at a train station with nothing but a broken promise and a worn suitcase, and from that low point she'd built something extraordinary. She'd found her place in the world. Not because someone handed it to her or because circumstances magically aligned, but because she'd fought for it with everything she had. Because she'd stood her ground when powerful men tried to push her aside. Because she'd chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. And standing there on the porch of her home, watching the sun set over land she'd helped defend, with a family she'd helped save, and who'd saved her in return, Elara Quinn Mercer finally understood what she'd been searching for all those years. She'd been looking for somewhere she mattered. Somewhere her choices had consequences, and her presence made a difference. Somewhere she could look at the people around her and know with absolute certainty that their lives were better because she was in them. She'd found it. Not in a city back east where she'd been just another desperate woman. Not in the promises of strangers who'd turned her away. But here, in the last place she'd ever expected, among people who'd given her a chance when she had nothing left to offer but determination and hope. The frontier had a way of stripping away everything false, everything unnecessary, until all that remained was what you were really made of. It tested people in ways that comfortable lives never could, demanded strength they didn't know they possessed, and forged bonds that couldn't be broken by anything short of death. Elara had passed that test. She'd proven that she was more than her circumstances, more than her fear, more than the limitations others tried to impose on her. She'd become someone her younger self wouldn't recognize. Stronger, braver, more certain of her own worth. And she'd done it not by becoming someone else, but by finally becoming fully herself. The woman who'd always been there underneath the survival and the desperation, just waiting for a chance to prove what she could do. As night fell over the ranch and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Colt came back from his work and climbed the porch steps. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood there together watching their world settle into evening peace. "Happy?" he asked quietly. Elara thought about it. She thought about everything they'd been through, everything they'd built, everything still to come. She thought about the battles won and the scars earned and the life they'd created from nothing but stubborn determination. "Yes," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I'm home." And she was. After years of searching, after countless disappointments and dead ends and moments when she'd thought she'd never find where she belonged, she'd finally arrived at the one place in the world where she was exactly who she was meant to be. The ranch would face more challenges. The frontier always did. There would be droughts and storms, setbacks and struggles, moments when survival seemed uncertain. But they'd face it together, this family forged from choice and circumstance and love that had been tested in fire. And whatever came next, Elara knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would never again be the woman sitting alone at a train station with nowhere to go. She'd found her strength, her purpose, and her place in the world. And no one, no circumstance, no threat, no powerful man was ever going to take that away from her again. This was her life, her family, her home, and she'd defend it with everything she had for as long as she drew breath. Because that's what you did when you finally found where you belonged. You held on tight, you fought for it, and you never ever let go.